doing my presentation on Slacktivism via Facebook. And so I'm going to be posting a bunch of stuff that's relevant to this presentation. I don't have enough time to go over everything that I'd like to go over, but I'm going to be talking about how Slacktivism relates to activism, and a little bit more about activism, what makes activism activism, and what creates change, in order to sort of elucidate sort of the misconceptions maybe associated with Slacktivism. Because Slacktivism, in a lot of ways, is really important to activism, I believe. So please, if you would like to friend this page on Facebook, you don't have to. It's completely open and available to see anything on there. There's no privacy settings preventing anything. So anyway, Slacktivism then is defined as a minimal effort via Facebook or what have you, to sort of support a cause that an individual believes in. And so when it comes to social issues, and when it comes to mental health stigma, homophobic stigma, transphobic stigma, gender stigma against women, racial stigma, in a lot of ways, what's really important for people who are in these oppressed groups is to have some level of acceptance. So people are always going to be doing these activist things. They're going to be having support groups. You're going to have a very minute amount of people who are actually going out there and doing something. And this has always been the case. There are going to be a few people who are really driven to do something that they feel is really important. And so that's where the PFLAG organizers are. That's where the sponsors of AA who maybe had an issue earlier on in life, but remained, and they kept supporting the alcoholic individuals who came in and sort of helped them. There are mental health support groups, and there are people who are willing and dedicated to do those things, but those things are above and beyond, and a lot of people don't have the resources or the time or the energy to do those things. So Slacktivism allows people to very simply support something, and yes, maybe it's just making them feel good about themselves. That's one of the arguments about Slacktivism, is that these people are just doing something and it's just simply helping themselves. But it's important to look at what research says about that, and I'll get into that a little bit later. When it comes to social acceptance of people who are in oppressed groups, though, this really does promote social change in that legislation is pushed. When people are talking about things and having conversations about things and publicly supporting things, it opens up the ability for a conversation to happen that politicians recognize, that laws recognize. I mean, when we look at gay marriage right now, and this is just the new thing that's happening, but what's happening right now is that acceptance is changing socially, and so now our laws are responding to this social change. And I would argue that a lot of this is different because since 2003, 2004, the way we get our information and the way we talk about our information has changed a lot. Anyone who wants a voice has a voice on Facebook or through the internet. And people can like those people on Facebook. They can support those things. And when they do like those things, it's not at no consequence, because these social changes, when someone supports marriage equality, for example, I had friends do this. It came at a huge risk to themselves. For me, it was almost Slacktivism because it wasn't a risk at all. But for my friends, some of them who live in western Nebraska and they're from these small towns, posting that came at a risk. Some people could, and I'm sure that there were people who got physically assaulted because of this. People risk losing family members' support, and that isn't really slacking. There's a lot of change happening when those things happen. But in addition to that, even with just things as simple as breast cancer, when someone sees someone who supports that or believes that those people think that that's something that's important, even if they're not doing anything, that can be beneficial to someone who is struggling with a specific issue. So briefly, people who are slacktivists, research shows, are just as likely as people who are not slacktivists to donate money to a cause that they believe in. So there's no relationship between whether or not you are a slacktivist and whether or not you spend money on these issues. But individuals who are slacktivists are twice as likely to volunteer for causes that they support. So they're not really slacking there necessarily, or they're not more likely to slack just because they are slacktivists. These individuals are also twice as likely to partake in events relevant to their slacktivist interests. They're 3 times more likely to seek out donations on behalf of the causes they believe in. So they might not be able to or willing to donate to the causes they believe in, but they're significantly more likely to try to get money for the things that they believe in and to work for that, in which that in a lot of ways is more beneficial. These individuals are also more than 4 times as likely to push for public policy or legislation that's relevant to a social cause by promoting either petitions or directly contacting elected officials themselves. So going back to stigma and oppression, individuals who are LGBT, for example, youth who are rejected are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide. They're 6 times as likely to report higher levels of depression, more than 3 times as likely to use illegal drugs, more than 3 times as likely to be at a high risk of contracting HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases. Individuals who are rejected are also more likely to be homeless, clinically depressed, clinically anxious, attempt suicide, complete suicide, abuse illegal drugs, and also have eating disorders. And this is because people are coping with and sort of trying to deal with the discrimination that they have. And research shows that people who are LGBT who do not have these experiences of discrimination and stigma actually have statistically similar levels of mental health variables and outcomes. And so people who are not stigmatized and not discriminated against in any fashion, and this is relevant to people with mental illness and people who are cultural minorities, people who don't experience this discrimination are much better off. When people have people who are accepting in larger social networks, especially if these children who are LGBT, if their parents aren't accepting, but they have a cousin and an aunt and an uncle who are very, very accepting and within reach via Facebook, or if they just have lots of friends who they see accept them, that does make a positive contribution on their health and mental health. And this is relevant to all types of stigma and all oppressed groups.